My son placed a glossy care home brochure next to my plate of roasted chicken and calmly announced that my name was already on the waiting list. I did not raise my voice. I did not flip the dining table. I finished my coffee, thanked his wife for the meal, and drove home in the quiet dark. 1 month later, my attorney called my son with a message that would permanently dismantle his life. Before I tell you exactly how I took everything from the son who tried to bury me alive, let me know which city you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that respect should never be sacrificed for greed. I am Calvin Ford. I am 67 years old, and until that Sunday evening, I believed I had built a legacy that would protect my family for generations. I was sitting at the dining table in the upscale suburban home I had helped my son Matthew and his wife Vanessa purchase. The dinner had been perfectly ordinary until Vanessa reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a thick, glossy pamphlet, and slid it across the polished mahogany table. The bold letters on the front read Sunset Pines Care Facility. Matthew refused to meet my eyes. He stared intensely at his half-eaten chicken. Vanessa, however, leaned forward with a perfectly practiced look of deep artificial sympathy. She placed her hand over mine, her manicured nails digging slightly into my skin. "Calvin, we have been talking," she said, her voice dripping with the kind of condescension usually reserved for a toddler. "We are getting very worried about your memory issues. You forgot your winter coat at the steakhouse last week, and you lost your reading glasses twice this month. It is simply not safe for you to live alone anymore." I stared at her. I had forgotten my coat, because the restaurant coat check had given it to the wrong patron, and I had simply bought a new one rather than wait around to complain. I lost my reading glasses because I fell asleep reading financial reports on my back porch. Matthew finally looked up, puffing out his chest to project an authority he had not earned. "Dad, we are stepping in for your own good. We have already contacted an attorney to have your power of attorney transferred to us. Sunset Pines has a wonderful memory care unit. We put down the deposit this morning. The audacity of it was a physical weight in the room." But before I could even formulate a response, Vanessa delivered the final calculated blow. "And you do not need to worry about the monthly fees," Vanessa added, her eyes gleaming with hidden triumph. "We have already started packing up your home office. My brother is moving into your house next weekend. He is going to pay rent directly to us, and we will use that money to cover your facility costs. We are streamlining your care, Calvin. It is a win for everyone." They had not invited me to dinner. They had invited me to my own eviction. They had already entered my home, touched my belongings, and leased my property to a stranger without my knowledge. They looked at me, a man who had spent 40 years building a commercial real estate empire from the dirt up, and saw nothing but an expired asset ready to be liquidated. I did not yell. I did not try to explain that my mind was sharper than it had been in my 30s. Anger is a wasteful emotion when you are sitting across from thieves. I picked up my napkin, carefully wiped my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I stood up, pushing my chair back slowly. "The chicken was a bit dry, Vanessa," I said, keeping my voice entirely flat and devoid of emotion. "But I appreciate the effort. Good night." I walked out of their front door and got into my car. My silence was the greatest gift I could have given them. By not fighting back, by walking away, I handed them the illusion of absolute victory. They thought the old man was finally broken. They had no idea that my silence was the beginning of their absolute destruction. The drive back to my house was a blur of streetlights and cold realization. I gripped the leather steering wheel, my mind tracing the history of everything I had built. When Matthew graduated with his business degree, I handed him the keys to the daily operations of my greatest achievement, a massive commercial warehouse park on the edge of the city. I let him manage the tenant leases, handle the maintenance crews, and play the big-shot CEO. But I never gave him the foundation. I owned the dirt beneath those concrete buildings. I held the master deeds. I allowed him to wear the crown, but I owned the kingdom. When I pulled into my driveway, the reality of Vanessa's words hit me. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the hallway. Stacked neatly against the floral wallpaper were a dozen heavy cardboard moving boxes. They had come into my sanctuary while I was at the golf course the day before. They had packed up my life as if I were already dead. I walked past the boxes and went straight into my master bedroom. I locked the door behind me. I pulled back the heavy Persian rug near the window and knelt on the hardwood floor. I pressed a specific sequence on the hidden floor, safe I had installed 20 years ago, a safe Matthew did not even know existed. The heavy steel door popped open with a quiet hiss. I reached inside, ignoring the stacks of emergency cash and the velvet boxes of my late wife's jewelry. I pulled out the thick leather binder containing my trust documents and the master deeds to the commercial warehouse park. I flipped through the heavy parchment pages. My heart stopped. The master deed for the warehouse park was gone. A cold sweat broke out on the back of my neck. Matthew had not just rented out my residential home to cover a nursing home bill. That was just a distraction, a smokescreen. He had been hunting for the commercial properties. He had somehow bypassed my security, found the safe, and taken the physical proof of my ownership. I looked at the clock on my nightstand. It was 11 at night. I picked up my cell phone and dialed the private number of Warren, my longtime commercial attorney, and one of the few men I trusted with my life. He answered on the third ring, his voice gruff from sleep. "Warren, I need you to log into the county registry immediately," I said, my voice tight with a suppressed fury that was slowly morphing into pure, cold adrenaline. "Look up the commercial warehouse park. Check the chain of title." I heard the sound of him shifting in bed, followed by the heavy clicking of his mechanical keyboard. A heavy, suffocating minute passed. The only sound in my bedroom was my own breathing. Calvin Warren finally spoke, his tone instantly shifting from sleepy to razor-sharp professional. "What is going on? A quitclaim deed was filed 3 days ago. It transfers the entire warehouse park, the land, the structures, the operational rights, into a newly formed limited liability company. Who owns the LLC?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Warren typed a few more keys. "The sole managing member of the LLC is Vanessa Ford. Calvin, there is a notary stamp and your signature on this digital scan. It looks flawless. Did you sign anything for Matthew recently?" I sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at the empty floor safe. I had not signed a single legal document in over a year. They had forged my signature, bribed or tricked a notary, and stolen a multi-million-dollar commercial empire right out from under me. "They are trying to put me in a memory care facility next month," I told Warren softly. "They rented out my house, and they stole the warehouse park." Warren let out a slow, heavy breath. "If they filed a forged deed, this is not just family drama, Calvin. This is federal fraud. I can call the police right now. We can have them in custody by morning." "No," I said, staring at the cardboard boxes stacked in my hallway. "Do not call the authorities. If we strike now, they will claim it was a misunderstanding. Matthew will say I gave him verbal permission and forgot due to my declining mental state. They will drag this through civil court for years." "What is the plan then?" Warren asked. The question was no longer why my son had betrayed me. The question was how deep the rot went, what they were planning to do with the stolen property, and how I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. "We are going to let them think they got away with it," I told Warren, my voice echoing in the empty room. "We are going to find out exactly what they are doing with that property. And then when they are standing at the absolute peak of their arrogance, we are going to cut the ground out from under them." The sun rose the next morning, painting the sky in pale shades of gray. I did not call my son. I did not send a text message demanding answers. The hardest discipline I ever learned in business was the restraint to sit entirely still while your opponent believes they hold the winning hand. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit I had not worn in years, carefully knotted my tie, and drove out to the city center to meet Warren. Warren had not been idle during the night. When I walked into his glass-walled office overlooking the skyline, he was already sitting with a man named Cross. Cross was an independent forensic accountant who did not work for law firms or corporate boards. He was a ghost who hunted stolen money for private clients, and he had a reputation for being absolutely ruthless in his methods. He did not care about family dynamics or emotional trauma. He only cared about the mathematical trail of deceit. I sat down at the heavy oak conference table and poured myself a glass of water. Cross did not offer any sympathetic greetings. He simply turned his laptop screen toward me and began to dismantle the illusion my son had built. Matthew and Vanessa did not just forge a deed to take ownership of the warehouse park. Cross explained, his voice entirely devoid of inflection. Thieves rarely steal an asset of that magnitude just to collect the monthly rent from the tenants. They steal it to leverage it. He pulled up a complex diagram of newly established corporate entities. Over the next 6 hours, the three of us sat in that room, tracing the toxic root system of my son's betrayal. Matthew had taken the forged quitclaim deed to a mid-tier commercial lender. Using the massive equity I had spent 40 years building in that land, he applied for a $4 million commercial loan against the warehouse park. The bank, seeing the flawless forgery and the pristine financial history of the property itself, approved the leverage. I watched the numbers flash across the screen, feeling a cold, hollow space open up in my chest. $4 million. It was a staggering amount of debt suddenly attached to the foundation of my life's work. "Where did the funds go?" Warren asked, leaning heavily against the edge of the table. Cross tapped a few keys, bringing up a labyrinth of wire transfers. The bank deposited the $4 million into the newly formed LLC, entirely controlled by Vanessa. Within 48 hours, she began moving the funds into a secondary shell corporation. We tracked every single dollar. The truth of their desperation finally came into focus. Vanessa owned a chain of high-end luxury wellness spas across the state. For the past 2 years, she had projected the image of a wildly successful entrepreneur, driving expensive cars and hosting lavish parties. But the forensic audit revealed a completely different reality. Her business was hemorrhaging cash. She was millions of dollars in debt to equipment suppliers, commercial landlords, and private investors. Her empire was nothing but a hollow shell on the verge of total bankruptcy. "She used your warehouse park as a life raft," Cross stated flatly. $2.5 million of the loan went immediately to paying off her hostile creditors and settling aggressive lawsuits that were about to become public. "She saved her own public image by mortgaging your entire legacy." But it did not stop there. The greed that fueled them was not satisfied by mere survival. Cross highlighted a massive offshore wire transfer that occurred just 3 days prior. After paying off the spa debts, Matthew and Vanessa took an additional $800,000 of the stolen loan money and purchased a 65-foot luxury recreational yacht. They registered it under a proxy name in a coastal harbor 200 miles away. I closed my eyes and pictured the dinner table from the night before. I pictured Vanessa smiling sweetly at me, offering me a plate of roasted chicken, while she secretly held the deed to a yacht bought with the blood and sweat of my entire career. I pictured Matthew puffing out his chest, playing the role of the responsible son, stepping up to care for his declining father while he actively drained the marrow from my bones. But a massive question still hung heavily in the air of the conference room. I opened my eyes and looked directly at Warren. A commercial bank does not simply hand over $4 million to a newly formed LLC just because a quitclaim deed was filed, I said, my voice steady and cold. I have dealt with these underwriters for decades. They require a rigorous chain of title verification. If a property is transferred from a father to a son out of nowhere, they mandate a direct sworn affidavit from the original owner to prevent exactly this type of elder fraud. Why did the bank not call me to verify the transfer? Warren looked at Cross. The accountant let out a long, heavy breath and reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out a single sheet of paper encased in a clear plastic folder and slid it slowly across the oak table toward me. "This is the loan origination file that we subpoenaed directly from the underwriter this morning," Washrawan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This is the final piece of paper Matthew submitted to bypass the bank's security protocols regarding your verification." I looked down at the document. It was a formal medical declaration stamped with the official seal of a prominent private neurology clinic in the city. The signature at the bottom belonged to a doctor I had never met in my entire life. I read the paragraphs slowly, letting the clinical typed words burn themselves into my memory. The document stated that Calvin Ford had been subjected to a comprehensive psychological and neurological evaluation. It stated that I was suffering from aggressive, rapid-onset dementia. It declared in absolute, legally binding terms that I possessed zero cognitive retention, that I was unable to recognize my own family members, and that I was entirely incompetent to manage my own financial or personal affairs. The document concluded by stating that contacting me for verification of the property transfer would cause severe emotional distress and was medically inadvisable, thus granting Matthew full unilateral authority to act on my behalf without any oversight. The silence in the room was absolute. Even Cross, the man who hunted stolen millions for a living, looked away, unable to meet my gaze. My own son had not just stolen my property, he had not just saddled my legacy with crippling, fraudulent debt. In order to get the money he needed to fund his wife's vanity and his own lavish lifestyle, he had gone to a corrupt doctor and legally erased my mind. He had put it on paper that the father who raised him, who paid for his education, who built the very company he pretended to run, was effectively dead. He declared me a ghost so he could loot my grave before I was even in the ground. If I had felt any lingering shred of paternal hesitation, any small instinct to protect the boy I had raised, it evaporated in that exact moment. It was replaced by a clarity so absolute and so freezing that I felt my pulse slow down to a steady, unshakable rhythm. Warren leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together. "Calvin, this medical declaration changes everything. It elevates this from a severe civil dispute into federal wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. If we take this to the authorities right now, Matthew and Vanessa will be arrested before the sun goes down." I looked at the forged medical document. I thought about the cheap plastic suitcases sitting in my hallway. I thought about the 30-day countdown to the care facility they had chosen for me. They had plotted this out with surgical precision. They believed they were the smartest people in the room. They believed I was too old, too tired, and too confused to ever understand what they had done to me. "No," I said, sliding the document back across the table. Warren blinked in surprise. "Calvin, what do you mean, no? They stole $4 million. I stood up from the heavy oak chair and buttoned my suit jacket. "If we arrest them today, they will cry panic and claim they made a desperate mistake. The money is already dispersed. The debt is already tied to the land. I do not just want them to face a legal penalty, Warren. I want them to feel exactly what they tried to do to me. They want to host a massive corporate event at my warehouse park at the end of the month to celebrate their new wealth. They are going to invite every politician and banker in the city." I looked at Cross, the accountant, who was now watching me with a glimmer of dark respect. "Trace the debt of Vanessa's spas," I instructed him. "Find out exactly who holds the paper on her failing businesses. I do not care what it costs. Find the proxy buyers. We are not going to stop the bleeding. We are going to buy the knives that are already in her back." I turned back to Warren. My voice was no longer the voice of a retired father. It was the voice of the man who had built an empire from the dirt up. "We are going to let them spend the next 2 weeks believing they are invincible," I said. "And then we are going to walk into their celebration and execute them in front of everyone they know." I walked out of the glass office and stepped into the elevator. The silent adjustment had moved past the stage of investigation. The trap was now being set. The morning after my meeting with the forensic accountant, I woke up with a clarity I had not felt since my early days in commercial development. I did not look at the cardboard moving boxes stacked in my hallway with sadness anymore. I looked at them as physical evidence of a crime. Matthew and his wife had constructed a very elaborate and highly illegal house of cards. The foundation of their entire scheme rested on a single piece of fraudulent paper. The fake medical declaration claiming I was suffering from advanced dementia was the linchpin of their operation. If that document stood, they controlled my life and my fortune entirely. If I destroyed that document, their massive financial leverage would instantly collapse into federal wire fraud and criminal conspiracy. I needed absolute, unquestionable proof of my sanity. I needed a medical counterstrike so powerful that no bank underwriter and no federal judge could ever doubt my cognitive reality. I spent the next 7 days executing a meticulous schedule coordinated by Warren. I did not go to a standard family physician or a neighborhood clinic. I went to 3 of the most respected board-certified specialists in the state. My first appointment was with a prominent neurologist named Dr. Adams. His clinic was a sterile fortress of glass and white marble, an intimidating environment for most people, but for me, it was simply a battleground. When I walked into his consultation room, I did not act like an old man seeking comfort. I sat perfectly straight in my chair and explained exactly what I required. I told him I needed a comprehensive defensive baseline of my neurological health to protect my commercial estate from a hostile takeover. Dr. Adams was a man of science, and he appreciated directness. He immediately ordered a full battery of physical and radiological tests. I spent over an hour inside the suffocating tube of a magnetic resonance imaging machine. I lay perfectly still in the cold, clinical darkness, listening to the loud, rhythmic hammering of the magnetic coils spinning around my head. While the machine mapped the physical structure of my brain, I mentally mapped the structure of the trap I was building for my son. When the imaging was finally complete, Dr. Adams called me back into his private office. He placed the high-resolution scans on a brightly lit screen. He pointed to the dense, healthy tissue and explicitly noted the complete absence of any plaque buildup or cerebral atrophy. He stated clearly that my brain showed the structural integrity and pristine health of a man decades younger. He drafted a detailed medical affidavit right then and there, confirming my absolute neurological soundness under penalty of perjury. 2 days later, I drove across the city to undergo an even more rigorous trial. Warren had secured a private appointment with Dr. Bennett, a leading forensic psychiatrist, who specialized in high-stakes competency evaluations for corporate executives facing shareholder disputes. His office was quiet and lined with heavy mahogany bookshelves meant to put nervous patients at ease, but I was not there to relax. I was there to go to war. Dr. Bennett administered an exhaustive series of cognitive exams designed to test the absolute limits of my mental capacity. For 5 straight hours, I sat at a heavy wooden desk, completing complex spatial reasoning puzzles, logic sequencing, matrices, and deep memory recall exercises. I treated every single question like a multi-million-dollar contract negotiation. I did not rush, but I did not hesitate. I recognized complex patterns in the testing data just as easily as I recognized the fatal legal flaws in my son's desperate financial maneuvers. When the grueling session finally concluded, Dr. Bennett spent a long time calculating the raw data in silence. When he finally looked up from his desk, his professional demeanor had shifted into a look of genuine, profound respect. He informed me that my cognitive processing speed and executive functioning were operating at the highest possible percentile. My formal intelligence quotient scored at 135. I was not just legally competent. I possessed a level of analytical sharpness and strategic retention that most young professionals never manage to achieve. He typed out a comprehensive psychological evaluation detailing his findings. He then called a licensed legal clerk into the room to formally notarize his signature on the heavy parchment paper. I now held 2 impenetrable shields of medical truth in my leather briefcase. But in the world of high-stakes commercial litigation, 2 documents is a coincidence. and 3 documents is an undeniable legal pattern. By the end of the week, I found myself sitting in the waiting room of a senior cognitive specialist to secure the third and final pillar of my defense. The waiting room was hushed with soft instrumental music playing through hidden speakers above the leather chairs. I sat alone holding my briefcase against my chest, feeling the physical weight of the sworn affidavits inside. I had done it. I had completely neutralized the fraudulent dementia claim. I had the legal ammunition required to invalidate the fake quitclaim deed and legally sever the $4 million loan Matthew had stolen. I was just waiting for the final doctor to call my name when I felt a sharp, persistent vibration in the breast pocket of my suit jacket. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cell phone. The screen was illuminated with a priority alert notification from my primary retail bank. It was an automated security message, but the words displayed on the glass sent a brief cold shock through my nervous system. I unlocked the device and opened my personal banking application. The loading circle spun for a few agonizing seconds before the main dashboard appeared. My available checking balance read exactly $0. My personal savings account, which held the operational cash I used for my daily living expenses and basic bills, was completely grayed out and inaccessible. A bright red banner stretched across the top of the mobile screen reading, "Account status frozen pending authorized conservator review." I stared at the glowing screen as the brutal reality of my son's overarching strategy fully materialized. Matthew was not simply satisfied with stealing the warehouse park and mortgaging my legacy to save his wife's failing business. He was actively moving to the next aggressive phase of his plan. He had taken the fake power of attorney document into the local retail branch of my bank early that morning. He had sat across from the branch manager and convinced them that his elderly father was rapidly losing his mind and required immediate protective financial intervention. He had frozen my daily checking accounts to completely cut off my cash supply. He was trying to financially starve me. The sheer cruelty of the maneuver was breathtaking in its scope. Matthew knew perfectly well that the care facility transport van was scheduled to arrive at my house in less than 2 weeks. He wanted to make absolutely certain that I had no resources whatsoever to fight back when that day arrived. He wanted to ensure I could not hire a lawyer, could not buy a plane ticket, and could not even pay for a cheap motel room to escape. He was locking every single door and window in my life, trying to force me into a state of total, desperate dependency so I would have no choice but to surrender, get into that van, and disappear into the bleak halls of the memory care unit forever. I sat in the quiet waiting room surrounded by soft music and slowly turned my phone completely off. I slipped it back into my suit pocket. Most men in my position would have panicked. Most elderly fathers facing a sudden total freeze of their personal finances would have felt a crushing sense of terror at the prospect of being left penniless. I did not feel terror. I felt a cold, dark sense of absolute amusement. Matthew truly believed he had just closed the steel trap on my leg. He thought he had left me with absolutely nothing but the clothes on my back. He had no idea about the secondary offshore corporate account my late wife Diane had insisted I open 30 years ago to protect our family from unseen disasters. He had no idea that while he was gleefully freezing my grocery money, I was already using a shadow proxy buyer funded by that offshore account to quietly purchase the distressed commercial debt of Vanessa's failing luxury spas. The clinic door opened, and a nurse wearing a dark blue uniform called my name. I picked up my leather briefcase and walked calmly toward her office. Matthew had just made his final and most fatal miscalculation. By attempting to starve me out and strip away my basic dignity, he had fully confirmed that there were absolutely no boundaries to his greed and no limits to his betrayal. He had just successfully removed the final microscopic shred of parental mercy I might have still held in my heart for him. The retail cash supply he froze was nothing but loose pocket change compared to the catastrophic financial avalanche I was preparing to drop directly onto his head. I walked into the examination room ready to collect my final piece of armor knowing the silent investigation was officially over and the public execution was about to begin. I left the medical clinic and drove directly to the main branch of my retail bank. The afternoon sun was pale and cold, casting long shadows across the polished granite steps of the building. I walked through the heavy glass doors with a steady rhythm, feeling the familiar hum of the financial institution I had done business with for over 30 years. The lobby was expansive with high vaulted ceilings that echoed with the low murmur of tellers and clients. The tellers behind the marble counter recognized me immediately, but instead of their usual warm greetings, they exchanged nervous glances. A young woman with a tight smile politely asked me to wait and hurried toward the glass-walled office at the back of the lobby. A few moments later, the branch manager, a man named Harrison, walked out to meet me. He looked deeply uncomfortable, his hands nervously adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. He guided me into his private office and closed the heavy blinds before sitting heavily in his leather executive chair. He did not offer me a cup of coffee or a glass of water. He simply folded his hands on his desk and looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Calvin." He began, his voice low and apologetic. "I am so sorry, but my hands are completely tied on this matter. Your son Matthew came in first thing this morning, right when the doors opened. He presented a fully notarized durable power of attorney, along with a certified medical declaration, stating that you are no longer capable of managing your own personal or financial affairs." I sat perfectly still, letting him speak. Harrison swallowed hard and continued, his tone full of regret. Based on the legal documentation he provided, the bank was legally obligated to comply with his directives immediately. "Matthew instructed us to freeze all of your personal retail accounts. Your checking, your standard savings, and your local safety deposit box are all under a strict conservatorship hold. You cannot withdraw cash, you cannot write checks, and your debit cards have been entirely deactivated." Matthew was very clear that all financial requests must now go directly through him to ensure your protection and well-being. Harrison leaned back, expecting me to explode into a fit of elderly rage or perhaps to break down in tears. He had undoubtedly seen families tear each other apart in this very office, fighting over the scraps of a declining parent's estate. He braced himself for the screaming. Instead, I looked at him and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was a slow, quiet expression of absolute clarity. Harrison blinked in confusion, clearly entirely unprepared for my reaction. "Calvin, did you hear what I just said? You have zero access to your personal funds." "I heard you perfectly, Harrison," I replied, keeping my voice even and calm. "And I do not blame you. You are just following the rigid legal protocols dictated by the fraudulent paperwork my son handed you. But Matthew made a very significant miscalculation. He assumes that the money in those retail accounts represents the entirety of my liquid capital. He assumes he knows everything about my financial history because I let him manage the warehouse park." I reached into the inner breast pocket of my suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black titanium card that bore no bank logo and no identifying numbers other than a small magnetic strip. I placed it gently on the polished wood of his desk. Harrison stared at the card, the color slowly draining from his face as he recognized what it was. It was a direct access key to the bank's private wealth management division, a tier of international banking that retail branch managers rarely interacted with, and only the ultra-wealthy ever possessed. "I need you to pick up your secure internal phone, Harrison," I instructed him gently. "I need you to connect me directly to the International Wealth Management Desk in Zurich. You are going to verify my identity using my biometric data, and then you are going to leave the room." Harrison did not say another word. He picked up the heavy black receiver, dialed a sequence of numbers, and handed the phone across the desk to me. He then stood up, walked out of his own office, and closed the heavy door behind him, leaving me in total privacy. I pressed the receiver to my ear and listened to the secure connection engage. 35 years ago, when Matthew was just a toddler, my late wife Diane and I sat at our small kitchen table late at night, reviewing our very first commercial real estate contracts. Diane was not a developer, but she possessed an instinct for survival that bordered on the prophetic. She knew that the world of high-stakes real estate was treacherous, full of sudden market crashes and ruthless competitors. She told me that night, as the rain beat against our window, that we needed a ghost account, a rainy day fund completely disconnected from our primary estate, completely invisible to domestic tax audits, and entirely untouchable by anyone other than ourselves. She insisted that true security was the money nobody knew you had. Over the next 3 decades, I quietly funneled a fraction of a % of every major deal, every successful lease, and every corporate buyout into an offshore corporate entity registered in a jurisdiction that did not share financial data with domestic retail banks. When Diane passed away, I left the account entirely dormant. I never touched it. I never mentioned it to Matthew. It was a silent fortress, waiting in the dark. A voice with a crisp European accent answered the phone, verifying my voice print and my security passcodes. The account was immediately unlocked. Matthew had frozen $50,000 in my local checking account. He had absolutely no idea that I had just gained unrestricted access to over $6 million in untraceable liquid capital. I did not transfer the money to my local accounts. That would have alerted Matthew and triggered a domestic audit. Instead, I kept the funds exactly where they were and initiated a highly specialized set of instructions. I hung up the secure line, walked out of the bank, leaving Harrison staring after me, and drove back to my empty house. I immediately called Cross, the ruthless forensic accountant I had hired the day before. Cross had already spent the past 24 hours mapping out the exact structure of my daughter-in-law's failing luxury spa business. Vanessa was drowning in bad paper. She owed money to luxury towel suppliers. She owed massive back payments on her high-end commercial leases, and she had taken out several aggressive short-term loans from private predatory lenders to keep her doors open. Her debt was scattered across a dozen different creditors, all of whom were rapidly losing patience and preparing to file lawsuits. Cross, I said the moment he answered his phone. Do you have the complete list of Vanessa's active creditors? I have every single one of them, Cross replied, his voice crackling slightly over the line. She is over-leveraged by roughly $2.8 million. The private lenders are getting ready to call in her collateral. She is terrified. That is why they stole your $4 million. They are planning to pay off these debts by the end of the month to avoid a highly public and humiliating bankruptcy. We are not going to let them pay off those debts, I told him, staring at the empty spaces in my hallway where my antique furniture used to be. I want you to set up a blind proxy purchasing firm immediately. Use the offshore routing numbers I am about to text you right now. I want you to contact every single one of Vanessa's creditors before the sun goes down today. What is the offer? Cross asked, already understanding the lethal nature of the strategy. He knew we were not acting out of charity, but out of calculated retribution. Offer them an aggressive cash buyout on her debt, I instructed. Tell the private lenders and the commercial landlords that our proxy firm will purchase Vanessa's outstanding debt from them immediately at 90 cents on the dollar in pure liquid cash. They will jump at the chance to unload a failing toxic asset and get guaranteed money today rather than fighting her in a messy bankruptcy court next year. Make the contracts ironclad and demand immediate transfer of all collection rights. I listened to Cross typing rapidly on his mechanical keyboard, the sound echoing like gunfire over the line. You understand what this means, Calvin. If we execute this proxy buyout, the original creditors disappear from the board entirely. Our shadow firm will consolidate all of her liabilities into a single weapon. You will become her sole institutional creditor. You will literally own her entire financial existence. Execute the purchases immediately, I said, my voice dropping to a low, steady whisper. Buy every single piece of paper she owes. Over the next 72 hours, while Matthew was busy picking out paint colors for his new yacht, and Vanessa was happily telling her country club friends that her father-in-law was moving to a lovely retirement home, the trap snapped shut beneath the surface of the water. Cross moved with the speed and precision of an apex predator. Using my offshore capital, he quietly approached Vanessa's landlords and lenders. Seeing a sudden influx of untraceable cash, they gladly sold their rights to collect. By Friday evening it was done. Vanessa thought her debts were scattered among a dozen angry suppliers who she could easily stall for another few weeks until the stolen loan money cleared. She had no idea that all of those debts had been silently rolled into one massive crushing boulder suspended directly over her head by a single frayed thread. She had no idea that the man she had mocked at the dinner table, the old man she had tried to starve out by freezing his checking account, was now the absolute master of her destiny. If she missed a single payment, if she violated a single term of her commercial leases, I now possessed the legal authority to seize her spas, liquidate her assets, and foreclose on her personal property without a moment of hesitation. I sat in my quiet, empty house pouring myself a glass of water from the tap. Matthew had taken my local bank cards. He had packed my belongings into cheap plastic suitcases. He thought he had completely disarmed me. But as I looked out the window at the setting sun, I knew the silent adjustment was complete. I did not just have the medical proof to destroy his life. I now had the financial leverage to absolutely obliterate his wife's entire world. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. All that was left to do was wait for the day of their grand celebration and let them pull the trigger on themselves. 2 weeks passed in absolute unbroken silence. I spent those 14 days tending to the overgrown rose bushes in my backyard and sitting on my wooden porch watching the autumn leaves slowly detach from the oak trees. I did not contact my lawyer, and I did not reach out to the forensic accountant. The heavy machinery of my revenge was already in motion, operating silently beneath the surface of my son's manufactured reality. Matthew did not call me. Vanessa did not stop by to check on my supposedly failing memory. They were entirely consumed by the intoxicating rush of their stolen wealth. They were busy signing proxy documents, buying expensive luxury items, and planning their grand ascension into the city elite. They left me completely alone in the large, empty house, assuming I was simply wasting away in a fog of elderly confusion. My silence was the fertile soil in which their arrogance grew to catastrophic proportions. The quiet illusion shattered on a crisp Tuesday afternoon. The loud, aggressive rumble of a high-performance engine echoed down my residential street. I was standing in the kitchen, wiping down the granite countertops, when I saw a brand-new European sports car pull sharply into my driveway. The car was painted a sleek metallic black, and it parked directly over my carefully manicured flower beds, crushing the fragile stems beneath its heavy custom tires. I watched through the window as Matthew stepped out of the driver's seat. He was wearing a stark white, custom-tailored suit that cost more than the entire first year of his college tuition. He walked up the driveway with a manufactured swagger, projecting the aggressive confidence of a man who believes he has finally conquered the world. He did not ring the doorbell. He used the heavy brass spare key he had never returned and pushed the front door open, allowing the cold autumn wind to sweep into the foyer. He was carrying 2 large objects in his hands. He dropped them onto the polished hardwood floor with a loud, hollow thud that echoed through the empty hallway. I walked slowly out of the kitchen and stood at the edge of the living room. Matthew did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was feeling or if I had eaten that day. He simply pointed a manicured finger at the objects on the floor. They were 2 large, rigid suitcases made of cheap gray plastic. The zippers looked fragile, and the wheels were constructed from hard, hollow rubber. They were the exact type of luggage you might find on the bottom shelf of a discount pharmacy. They possessed absolutely no dignity and no warmth. They were containers designed for disposal, not for life. Matthew leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing his arms over his expensive suit jacket. He looked at me with an expression of supreme irritation mixed with a thin layer of artificial pity. He spoke in a loud, slow cadence, deliberately enunciating his words, as if he were trying to communicate with someone who was entirely deaf or profoundly stupid. He told me that the transport van from the Sunset Pines Care Facility was scheduled to arrive in exactly 14 days. The 30-day grace period they had granted me was rapidly coming to an end. He instructed me to start sorting through my entire life immediately. He pointed at the cheap gray plastic and stated very clearly that I was only allowed to bring whatever could fit inside those 2 empty shells. The facility did not allow personal furniture or large sentimental items. He explained that everything else in the house, the antique mahogany desk I used to build my business, the original oil paintings Diane had collected, the hundreds of family photographs framing the staircase, would be handled by a professional estate liquidation company. He had already signed the contract to have strangers walk through my home and sell the physical evidence of my existence to the highest bidder. I looked at the cheap plastic bags, and then I looked at my son. I felt a deep, profound coldness settle into my chest. He was standing in the house I had paid for, breathing the air I had provided for him his entire life, and he was casually instructing me to compress 70 years of memories into a few cubic feet of discount plastic. But Matthew could not just deliver the eviction notice and leave. A thief who believes he has executed the perfect, flawless crime always requires an audience to validate his genius. He needed me to understand just how incredibly successful he had become since he seized control of my assets. He uncrossed his arms and began to pace around my living room, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He puffed out his chest and began to boast about a massive corporate merger he was orchestrating. He told me he was hosting a grand gala at the commercial warehouse park at the very end of the month. It was going to be the largest luxury corporate event the city had seen in a decade. He had hired a massive catering company, rented enormous white canvas pavilions, and secured an open bar featuring the most expensive imported spirits available. He boasted that he had personally invited the mayor, the city council members, and the entire executive board of the regional commercial bank. He was going to stand on a raised podium in front of the most powerful people in the state and announce the integration of his new shell corporations. He wanted to show the world that he was no longer just the son of a local developer, but a financial titan in his own right. He stopped pacing and stood directly in front of the stone fireplace. Resting on the mantel was a framed silver photograph from the original ribbon-cutting ceremony of the warehouse park in the early 90s. The picture showed me standing in a simple gray suit, holding a pair of oversized scissors, smiling proudly next to the first 3 tenants who had trusted my vision. Matthew picked up the heavy silver frame and stared at the photograph for a long moment. He scoffed a sharp, derisive sound that cut through the quiet room. He turned the photograph toward me and shook his head in absolute disgust. He told me that my vision for the property had always been pathetic. He said he was finally fixing the massive conservative mistakes I had made back in the 90s. He criticized my absolute refusal to leverage the land, my insistence on maintaining zero debt, and my obsession with slow, sustainable growth. He called my entire business philosophy cowardly and outdated. He tossed the silver frame back onto the mantel, letting it clatter loudly against the stone. He boasted that his new aggressive leverage model was going to quadruple the perceived value of the property in a single fiscal year. He claimed that taking out the $4 million loan was a stroke of absolute financial genius that I would have never possessed the courage to execute. He told me that my life work was nothing but a stagnant pond, and he was finally opening the floodgates to turn it into an ocean of endless capital. I stood in the center of the living room, absorbing every single arrogant word. I did not raise my voice to defend my legacy. I did not point out that his magnificent ocean of capital was built entirely on forged signatures, stolen land, and federal wire fraud. I did not mention that the money he was so proud of was currently being used to desperately plug the massive holes in his wife's sinking vanity projects. Instead, I physically sank into the role he had written for me. I allowed my shoulders to slump forward, rounding my spine to mimic the heavy posture of a defeated old man. I lowered my gaze to the floor, staring blankly, at the cheap gray suitcases. I let my hands tremble slightly at my sides. I looked up at him with wide, tired eyes and offered him a weak, submissive nod. I told him in a quiet, gravelly voice that I understood. I told him I would start folding my clothes and packing the plastic bags immediately. I promised him I would be completely ready and waiting by the front door when the facility van arrived in 14 days. Matthew looked at my slumping posture and smiled. It was a cold, victorious smile devoid of any human empathy. He saw exactly what he wanted to see. He saw a broken, confused father, completely surrendering to the inevitable end. He adjusted the lapels of his custom white suit, turned his back on me, and walked out the front door without saying another word. I listened to the heavy door click shut. I listened to his loud European sports car roar to life and speed away down the quiet residential street. When the sound finally faded into the distance, I stood up perfectly straight. I stopped my hands from trembling. I looked at the cheap plastic suitcases sitting on my floor and felt a slow, dark smile spread across my face. Matthew thought he had just delivered my absolute death sentence. He thought he had cemented his total victory and guaranteed my permanent silence. He was entirely blind to the reality of the situation. By arrogant boasting about his grand gala at the warehouse park, by giving me the exact date and the exact guest list of his massive corporate celebration, he had just handed me the final missing piece of my strategy. He had just provided me with the perfect stage, the perfect audience, and the exact precise moment for his own spectacular public execution. The 30-day notice was not a countdown to my imprisonment. It was the final countdown to his absolute destruction. The digital clock on my dashboard glowed a pale green, displaying exactly 2 in the morning. The city was completely asleep, but my mind was operating with the sharp, precise hum of a high-voltage generator. I turned my car off the main highway and coasted quietly down the long industrial access road leading to the commercial warehouse park. The sheer scale of the property always gave me a deep sense of quiet pride. Massive steel and concrete structures rose up against the night sky, casting enormous shadows over the endless rows of loading docks. I had poured 20 years of my life into pouring the foundations of this place. Matthew had recently installed a brand new state-of-the-art electronic security perimeter. High-definition cameras swept the entrance, and a heavy reinforced steel gate blocked the main driveway. He had boasted to his country club friends that the property was an impenetrable fortress now. But a fortress is only as strong as the architect who designed its original blueprints. Matthew had changed the digital keypads and hired a new private security firm, but he had been far too lazy to completely replace the subterranean wiring systems I had personally installed during the initial construction phase. I parked my car out of sight behind a thick row of evergreen trees bordering the property line. I walked through the damp grass, feeling the chill of the autumn night seep through my dark woolen coat. I approached a secondary utility access door hidden behind a massive electrical transformer box at the far edge of the main administrative building. Matthew did not even know this door existed. I pulled a small, heavy brass key from my pocket, inserted it into the rusted lock, and turned it. The mechanism clicked with a satisfying, heavy sound. I pushed the door open and stepped into the silent, dark corridor of the central office. The administrative building was perfectly still. I walked through the hallways, navigating purely by muscle memory. I did not need a flashlight. I knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the executive suite. When I entered the main office, I could see the superficial changes Matthew had made. He had replaced my heavy oak furniture with sterile glass tables and cheap modern art. He had installed massive flat-screen monitors on every wall to display his hollow financial projections. But he had completely ignored the heavy industrial fireproof filing cabinets bolted to the concrete floor in the back storage room. Matthew lived entirely in a digital world of scanned copies and cloud storage. He fundamentally did not understand the undeniable legal gravity of physical ink on parchment. I walked into the storage room and knelt in front of the oldest cabinet. I spun the mechanical combination dial, entering a sequence of numbers only I and my late wife had ever known. The heavy steel drawer slid open smoothly. I reached deep into the back and pulled out a thick, bound leather portfolio. Inside this portfolio were the original ink signed commercial master leases for every single tenant operating in the park. These documents contained specific termination clauses, ownership transfer protocols, and unalterable legal frameworks that superseded any digital copy Matthew claimed to possess. These were the true chains that bound the tenants to the land, and they were now resting securely in my hands. I did not break any glass. I did not vandalize his glass desk or erase his hard drives. True sabotage is never loud. True sabotage is the silent removal of the single load-bearing pillar that holds up the entire roof. I closed the heavy steel drawer, locked the utility door behind me, and vanished into the night completely undetected. The next morning, the sun was shining brightly as I walked into the private dining room of an exclusive downtown business club. I was not there to eat. I was there to meet with a man named Sterling. Sterling was the regional executive director of a massive international shipping and logistics conglomerate. His company was the anchor tenant of my warehouse park. They occupied over 40% of the total square footage, and their lease was the absolute bedrock of the entire property valuation. Sterling was a hard, brilliant man who had spent 40 years climbing the corporate ladder. He respected loyalty, stability, and mutual profit. When I was managing the park, Sterling and I had a fantastic working relationship based on mutual respect and a handshake that meant something. Over the past few months, however, things had drastically changed. Matthew had taken over the daily operations, and his arrogant, penny-pinching management style had deeply insulted the shipping giant. Matthew had aggressively tried to renegotiate maintenance contracts, ignored severe infrastructure requests, and treated Sterling's seasoned executives like foolish subordinates. Sterling absolutely despised my son. He was already actively looking for legal loopholes to break their massive lease and move his entire operation to a competing state. I sat at the polished wooden table and waited. Precisely at 9 o'clock, Sterling walked into the private room. He wore a sharp navy suit and carried a briefcase that likely held the gross domestic product of a small island nation. He sat down across from me, ordering a black coffee from the waiter before leaning forward, resting his forearms on the table. "Calvin," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble, "it is very good to see you again. But I will be completely honest with you. If you are here to apologize for the absolute circus your son has been running out at the logistics park, we have nothing to talk about. My board of directors is furious. Matthew has violated our trust, and we are preparing a massive legal exit strategy." I took a slow sip of my water and looked him directly in the eyes. "I am not here to apologize for my son Sterling," I said, keeping my voice entirely calm and steady. "I am here to offer you the opportunity to permanently fire him." Sterling stopped moving. His coffee arrived, but he completely ignored the cup. He narrowed his eyes, studying my face, looking for any sign of a bluff. "Go on," he commanded softly. I opened my leather briefcase and placed 2 items on the polished table between us. First, I laid down the thick, bound portfolio containing the original ink, signed master lease of his shipping conglomerate. Second, I placed the authenticated medical affidavits proving my absolute cognitive sanity alongside the forensic evidence of Matthew's forged quitclaim deed. Sterling was a veteran of brutal corporate warfare. It took him less than 5 minutes to read through the documents and fully understand the absolute gravity of the situation. He realized instantly that Matthew was operating a fraudulent enterprise and that I still legally held the master keys to the kingdom. "Matthew has mortgaged the dirt under your loading docks to fund his wife's failing vanity projects," I explained smoothly. "He thinks he owns the property, but he is legally nothing more than a trespasser. When the federal authorities eventually unravel his fraud, this entire park will be tied up in messy criminal litigation for years. Your operations will be frozen." Your supply chains will be completely compromised by the resulting investigations. Sterling leaned back in his chair, his jaw set tight. And what is your proposed solution, Calvin? I offer you the ultimate prize, I replied. For 20 years you have paid millions in rent to operate your logistics hub on my land. You have always wanted to own the dirt beneath your buildings to secure your supply chain permanently. I am ready to sell you the entire commercial warehouse park today. I will sell it to your conglomerate directly bypassing Matthew entirely, and I will sell it at a 10% discount under the current market appraisal. You get total control of the property, and Matthew is instantly, completely liquidated. Sterling's eyes widened slightly, a rare display of emotion from a man made of corporate steel. He looked at the original lease and then up at me. That is a magnificent offer, Calvin. We will buy the land. We can draft the purchase agreement this afternoon and wire the funds by the end of the week. I held up a single hand, stopping him. There is one non-negotiable condition to this sale, I stated, my voice dropping to a low, chilling register. You can draft the paperwork today, and you can put the funds into a secure escrow account tomorrow. But the actual final execution of the sale, the public transfer of the deed, must occur on a very specific date. What date? Sterling asked. Matthew is hosting a massive corporate gala at the warehouse park at the end of the month, I told him. He has invited the mayor, the bankers, and the local press. He intends to stand on a stage and declare himself the king of the industry. I need you to attend that gala, Sterling. I need you to stand in the crowd. And exactly when Matthew raises his glass to toast his magnificent stolen empire, I need you to execute the purchase agreement. A slow, dark smile spread across Sterling's face. He understood exactly what I was building. He saw the sheer devastating poetry of the trap. I was not just going to take the property back from my son. I was going to let him throw $1 million party to celebrate a kingdom that would evaporate into thin air the exact moment he tried to claim it. Sterling reached across the wide wooden table and extended his hand. Calvin, he said, his voice filled with profound, absolute respect. It is an honor to do business with you again. We have a deal. I shook his hand firmly, feeling the cold steel of the trap lock permanently into place. Matthew had 14 days left. He had 14 days to buy expensive suits, order expensive champagne, and tell everyone how brilliant he was. He had absolutely no idea that the ground he was planning to stand on had just been legally completely vaporized. I left the private dining club with Sterling's handshake still fresh in my memory and drove straight to the legal district of the city. The sky was overcast, casting a flat gray light over the heavy stone buildings that housed the federal courts and the top-tier law firms. I walked into Warren's office and placed my leather briefcase on his heavy oak desk. I opened it and took out the preliminary purchase agreement signed by the regional director of the largest logistics conglomerate in the state. I slid the document across the polished wood. Warren read it in complete silence. When he finished, he looked up at me and let out a long, slow breath. He realized immediately that I had not just found a buyer. I had recruited an executioner. Warren stood up and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the city skyline. He explained the precise legal mechanism we were about to trigger. It was a concept known in jurisprudence as void ab initio, which translates to void from the beginning. Matthew had assumed that by filing a forged quitclaim deed, he had successfully transferred the title of the warehouse park into Vanessa's newly formed limited liability company. He believed that even if I eventually discovered the theft, we would be locked in a civil dispute for years, arguing over whether he manipulated me. But Warren explained that a forged document does not create a contestable transfer. A forged document is a legal phantom. It possesses absolutely no power and conveys absolutely no rights. Therefore, the deed was not just illegal, it was entirely void. Vanessa did not own the warehouse park. She owned a worthless piece of paper. This legal absolute created a catastrophic chain reaction for my son. When Matthew took that void deed to the commercial bank and used it as collateral to secure a $4 million loan, he crossed a massive, uncrossable line. The bank underwriters had wired millions of dollars into Vanessa's shell corporation, based entirely on the premise that they held a secure mortgage on the physical land. But because the deed was a forgery, the bank actually held a mortgage on thin air. They had handed over $4 million of unsecured cash. Furthermore, Matthew had facilitated this transaction using a fabricated medical document, declaring me mentally incompetent. By transmitting fraudulent documents and receiving stolen funds across electronic banking networks, Matthew had escalated his crime from a local family dispute to multiple counts of severe federal wire fraud and criminal bank fraud. "We are not going to file a standard civil lawsuit," Warren told me, his voice echoing slightly in the large, quiet office. "A civil suit requires us to serve Matthew with a formal notice which gives him time to hire defense attorneys, hide the remaining cash, and prepare a false narrative. Instead, we are going to federal court this afternoon. We are going to file a silent, sealed injunction directly with a federal magistrate judge." Warren spent the next 5 hours drafting the most devastating legal document I had ever seen. He compiled the forensic accounting report from Cross, detailing exactly how the $4 million was funneled into Vanessa's failing spas and the offshore yacht purchase. He attached the 3 sworn affidavits from the board-certified neurologists and psychiatrists, proving my absolute cognitive sanity and exposing the fraudulent dementia declaration. He included the original ink-signed master leases and the new purchase agreement from Sterling. Every single piece of paper was an undeniable nail in my son's coffin. Late that afternoon, Warren and I walked together into the federal courthouse. It was a massive, imposing structure of white marble and dark oak designed to make every individual feel small in the face of absolute justice. We did not go to a public courtroom. Warren used his decades of experience to secure a private emergency audience in the chambers of a federal magistrate judge he had known for years. The judge was a stern, uncompromising woman with gray hair and sharp, penetrating eyes. She sat behind her heavy desk and reviewed the thick binder of evidence Warren presented to her. The room was entirely silent, except for the sound of pages turning. I watched her face as she read through the timeline of the betrayal. I saw her jaw tighten when she reached the forged medical declaration. The legal system deals with theft every single day, but there is a special, deeply rooted disgust reserved for those who use the medical system to falsely imprison and strip the dignity of the elderly. After 45 minutes, she closed the heavy binder and looked directly at me. She asked me a series of precise questions to confirm my identity, my mental clarity, and my understanding of the documents presented. I answered her with the steady, unwavering voice of a man who had spent 40 years building commercial empires. She did not see a confused old man ready for a care home. She saw a profoundly lucid victim of a massive financial crime. The judge picked up her heavy black fountain pen. She granted the ex parte injunction immediately. Furthermore, she signed a sealed federal order freezing every single asset connected to Matthew and Vanessa's limited liability companies. She authorized the immediate preparation of federal arrest warrants for both of them based on the undeniable evidence of wire fraud and forgery. But the most crucial element of her ruling was the seal itself. A sealed federal order means that the target of the investigation is completely unaware of their impending doom. The court records are entirely hidden from public view. The banks are legally prohibited from notifying the account holders that their funds are about to be seized. Matthew would not receive a warning letter in the mail. Vanessa would not get a courtesy phone call from her local branch manager. The guillotine was raised completely in the dark, and it would remain suspended in absolute silence until the exact moment the federal marshals decided to drop the heavy blade. We thanked the judge and walked out of the heavy marble building as the sun began to set over the city. Warren stopped on the courthouse steps and turned to me. He told me that the legal machinery was now fully operational. The federal authorities needed a few days to coordinate the asset seizures and prepare the arrest teams. He looked at me and asked how I wanted to handle the final execution of the trap. I looked out over the busy city streets, watching the headlights of the cars begin to illuminate the coming night. I told Warren that Matthew was hosting his grand corporate gala at the Warehouse Park on Saturday evening. I told him that Matthew was planning to stand on a stage in front of the mayor, the bankers, and the local press to celebrate his magnificent stolen empire. I told Warren that there was no better place and no better time for the federal authorities to execute their warrants than right in the middle of his crowning achievement in front of everyone he wanted to impress. Warren nodded slowly, a look of grim satisfaction settling over his features. He promised me he would coordinate the exact timing perfectly with the federal marshals. I drove back to my empty house and unlocked the front door. The cheap plastic suitcases Matthew had dropped off were still sitting exactly where he had left them on the living room floor. I walked into my bedroom and began to systematically pack my clothes. I folded my shirts and placed them into the cheap gray plastic. I packed my shaving kit and my worn leather belts. I played the part of the defeated father perfectly in the solitude of my own home, knowing that every single item I placed into those bags was just a necessary prop for the final act of a masterpiece. The board was now completely set. The pieces were locked into their final inescapable positions. Cross held the proxy debt that would utterly crush Vanessa's luxury spa business. Sterling held the purchase agreement that would completely rip the commercial warehouse park out from under Matthew's feet. The federal magistrate judge held the sealed warrants that would strip them of their freedom entirely. I sat down in my favorite armchair and looked out the window, watching the darkness fully envelop my neighborhood. I simply had to wait. I had to wait for the 30-day notice to expire. I had to wait for the care home van to pull up to my driveway. I had to wait for my son to put on his expensive, custom-tailored suit, stand up in front of the entire city, and stick his head willingly into the noose he had tied with his own 2 hands. The silent adjustment was officially finished. The legal guillotine was primed and waiting. All that remained was the fall. The morning of the 30th day arrived with a heavy gray overcast that matched the cold, mechanical nature of my son's plan. I was not standing in the hallway when the Sunset Pines Care Facility transport van finally pulled into my driveway. I was sitting comfortably in a luxury hotel suite across the city, sipping a hot cup of black coffee and watching the entire sequence of events unfold on a digital tablet. I had secretly installed hidden micro cameras in the corners of my living room and foyer the day before I departed. I wanted to witness the exact moment my son realized his perfect illusion had completely fractured. The security footage showed the sterile white transport van parking near the curb. 2 orderlies dressed in matching blue scrubs stepped out and walked to the back of the vehicle, pulling out a collapsible wheelchair. A few moments later, Matthew's sleek black European sports car pulled up right behind the van. He stepped out wearing another incredibly expensive custom suit, while Vanessa emerged from the passenger side wearing a dark designer dress. They had dressed up for the occasion, playing the part of the solemn, concerned family members who were making a tragic but necessary medical decision for their poor, declining father. I watched through the high-definition feed as Matthew approached the 2 orderlies. He shook their hands, put on a mask of deep artificial sadness, and pointed toward my front door. He led the way up the concrete path, pulling his heavy brass key from his pocket. I could see the slight, confident smirk on Vanessa's face as she followed him. They were expecting to walk into a house smelling of old age and defeat. They fully expected to find me sitting on the living room couch, clutching those 2 cheap gray plastic suitcases, waiting to be quietly escorted out of my own life. Matthew inserted the key and pushed the heavy wooden door open. He stepped into the foyer and stopped so abruptly that Vanessa bumped into his back. The house was not just empty. It was an absolute echoing void. Over the previous 48 hours, I had hired an elite private relocation firm that specialized in absolute discretion. I did not just pack my clothes. I had them remove every single piece of furniture Every antique rug, every painting on the wall, and every dish in the kitchen cupboards. I even had them unscrew the light bulbs from the lamps and take the heavy velvet curtains down from the windows. The house was stripped down to the bare hardwood floors and the white painted walls. It looked as though absolutely no one had lived there for a decade. The air inside the house was perfectly still and smelled faintly of the industrial cleaner the crew had used to wipe down the empty floors. I watched Matthew step further into the hallway, his expensive leather shoes echoing loudly in the completely barren space. He turned his head frantically from side to side, looking into the empty dining room and the vacant kitchen. His confident posture dissolved instantly, replaced by a rigid, jagged panic. He ran up the wooden staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Through the camera feed, I heard his heavy footsteps pounding against the floorboards of the second story as he checked my master bedroom, the guest rooms, and the bathrooms. He found absolutely nothing. There was no trace of my existence left in the entire structure. A few minutes later, he walked slowly back down the stairs, his face entirely pale. Vanessa was standing in the center of the empty living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, looking incredibly irritated rather than concerned. She complained loudly that her brother was scheduled to arrive with a moving truck in less than an hour to take over the property. She demanded to know where I had gone and who had authorized the removal of the expensive furniture she had planned to sell. Matthew did not answer her. He was staring straight ahead at the center of the living room wall. During the entire relocation process, I had left exactly one item behind. I watched Matthew walk slowly toward the wall, his eyes locked onto the object. Driven into the drywall right at eye level was a single heavy iron nail. Hanging from that nail was the glossy promotional brochure for the Sunset Pines Care Facility, the exact same brochure they had slid across the dining table 30 days ago. Matthew reached out with a trembling hand and pulled the brochure off the nail. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. The psychological breakdown I had anticipated was finally beginning to take root in his mind. The absolute impossibility of the situation was crashing down on him. He had gone into a bank and sworn under penalty of perjury that I was suffering from rapid onset advanced dementia. He had legally declared that I possessed zero cognitive retention and could not even manage to remember my own coat. But the reality staring him in the face completely shattered that narrative. A man with severe advanced dementia does not orchestrate the flawless, silent evacuation of a 4-bedroom estate. A confused old man does not hire professional ghost crews, scrub a house clean, and vanish into thin air without leaving a single financial trace on his frozen retail bank accounts. I watched Matthew pull his cell phone from his suit pocket, his fingers shaking as he rapidly dialed my number. He held the phone to his ear. I knew exactly what he was hearing. He was hearing the automated carrier message informing him that the number had been permanently disconnected. He lowered the phone and stared at the blank screen. He was completely out of control. If I was gone and I was clearly in possession of my full mental faculties, he was suddenly standing on incredibly dangerous ground. He realized he had absolutely no idea what I knew, what I had taken, or where I was hiding. The carefully constructed cage he had built for me was completely empty, and the lock had never even been engaged. The 2 orderlies from the care facility appeared in the open doorway, pushing the empty wheelchair over the threshold. They looked around the barren living room in absolute confusion. One of them asked Matthew if there had been a mistake with the scheduling, or if the patient had been moved to a different location. Matthew turned to them, his face a mask of barely controlled terror and humiliation. He snapped at them, telling them there had been a massive miscommunication and aggressively ordering them to take their wheelchair and leave the property immediately. He practically shoved them out the front door and slammed it shut behind them, locking the deadbolt. Vanessa walked up behind him, still complaining about the logistics of her brother's move. She told Matthew he needed to call the police right now and file a missing persons report so they could track my location and force me into the facility. Matthew spun around and glared at his wife with absolute fury. I watched him grab her by the arm and drag her away from the windows. He hissed at her, explaining the fatal flaw in her logic. He told her that if they called the police to report a missing elderly man, the authorities would launch a full investigation. They would start interviewing neighbors, pulling traffic camera footage, and looking into my financial records. And if the police found me sitting comfortably somewhere entirely lucid and capable, the police would immediately start asking very difficult questions about why Matthew had forcibly frozen my accounts and filed a medical conservatorship. He realized he could not alert the authorities without exposing his own massive fraud. He was trapped by his own lies. He had to pretend that everything was perfectly fine while secretly knowing that a massive unseen threat was currently looming over his entire life. I watched him pace back and forth across the empty living room, running his hand nervously through his perfectly styled hair. He was desperately trying to rationalize the situation, to construct a narrative that allowed him to maintain his stolen wealth. I saw the exact moment his arrogance finally overpowered his fear. He stopped pacing and took a deep breath. He turned to Vanessa and told her to calm down. He convinced himself that I had simply run away out of fear. He reasoned that because he had frozen my local bank accounts, I had no money and no resources. He assumed I had hired a cheap cash moving crew, sold the furniture to a pawn shop, and fled the state to live in hiding. He told Vanessa that my disappearance was actually a blessing. It meant they did not have to deal with the monthly facility payments anymore. He reminded her that they still held the quitclaim deed to the commercial warehouse park, and they still possessed the $4 million in corporate accounts. He decided to completely ignore the massive glaring warning sign I had left hanging on the wall. He chose to believe that his forged paperwork was more powerful than reality. He looked at his expensive watch and told Vanessa they needed to leave immediately. He told her they had to meet the catering coordinators and the event planners at the warehouse park to finalize the setup for the grand gala that evening. He declared that nothing was going to ruin the most important night of his corporate career. I watched them walk out the front door and get back into their sports car, leaving the empty house behind. The feed from the hidden cameras showed the completely barren living room, the single iron nail still protruding from the drywall. I turned off the digital tablet and finished my coffee. Matthew had chosen the path of maximum arrogance. He was going to push forward with his massive celebration, believing he had successfully weathered the storm. He had absolutely no idea that he was walking directly into the center of a federal trap. He was about to put on a tuxedo, drink expensive champagne, and stand on a stage in front of the entire city. And I was going to be there to personally ensure that his spectacular rise ended in the most devastating public collapse imaginable. The quiet phase of the operation was officially over. The evening was rapidly approaching, and the legal guillotine was perfectly primed for the main event. The evening sky over the commercial warehouse park was illuminated by sweeping industrial spotlights that cut through the autumn darkness. I pulled my car into the massive newly paved parking lot and parked in the shadows near the perimeter fence. Matthew had spared absolutely no expense for his grand corporate gala. He had transformed the massive central loading courtyard of the administrative complex into an opulent outdoor ballroom. Enormous white canvas pavilions were erected over the concrete, complete with crystal chandeliers suspended from the temporary ceilings. A classical string quartet played softly in the corner, their music mingling with the clinking of expensive champagne flutes and the low hum of wealthy conversation. This was the physical manifestation of his $4 million theft. I walked slowly toward the main entrance, watching the valet drivers park a continuous stream of luxury vehicles. Matthew had invited the absolute elite of the city. I saw city council members, local politicians, and the executive board of the regional commercial bank mingling under the bright lights. They were all completely unaware that they were drinking stolen wine and standing on legally vaporized ground. They were celebrating the coronation of a king who had built his entire castle out of forged paper. I did not walk toward the entrance alone. Emerging from an unmarked dark sedan parked near the gate was Warren, holding a thick black leather folder containing the sealed federal orders. Flanking him were two massive men wearing dark suits and severe expressions. They were senior federal marshals from the Financial Crimes Division. They did not look like private security guards. They carried the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute federal authority. We formed a line of 4 and began our approach toward the grand double doors of the main pavilion. Inside the massive tent, Matthew was standing on a raised wooden podium. He was bathed in a warm spotlight, wearing a bespoke tuxedo that fit him flawlessly. Vanessa stood at the base of the stage wearing a glittering evening gown, smiling for the hired photographers who circled the crowd. She looked completely radiant, entirely convinced that her failing spas were saved, and her future as a high society elite was permanently secured. Matthew tapped the microphone, and the ambient noise of the crowd slowly faded into an expectant silence. The string quartet stopped playing. Matthew looked out over the sea of wealthy faces and offered them a bright, incredibly confident smile. He began his speech by talking about the future. He spoke about the necessity of aggressive corporate modernization and the courage required to leverage massive assets for exponential growth. He told the crowd that for decades, this massive logistics park had been operated with a stagnant, fearful mindset. He did not explicitly say my name, but the implication was heavy and deliberate. He painted the picture of an outdated old man who was too scared to take risks, holding back the true economic potential of the land. He boasted that under his new management and his new holding company, the property had already secured $4 million in fresh capital. He promised the politicians increased tax revenues, and he promised the bankers endless returns on their investments. I stood just outside the glass double doors, listening to his arrogant voice echo through the sound system. I looked through the glass and spotted Sterling, the regional director of the massive shipping conglomerate, standing near the back of the crowd. Sterling was holding a glass of sparkling water, looking up at Matthew with an expression of cold, calculating, absolute disgust. Sterling knew the truth. He knew he held the purchase agreement for the ground Matthew was currently standing on. A pair of private security guards stationed at the doors stepped forward and raised their hands, attempting to block our path. They told us the event was strictly private and asked to see our invitations. The federal marshal on my right did not even break his stride. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his gold federal badge, and held it directly in front of the guard's face. He instructed the guard to step aside immediately or face federal obstruction charges. The private security guard took one look at the badge, completely drained of color, and scrambled backward, pulling the heavy glass door open for us. We crossed the threshold. I did not enter the room looking like the broken, confused, elderly man Matthew had tried to convince the world I was. I was wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit crafted from heavy Italian wool. My posture was perfectly straight, my shoulders thrown back, and my gaze was locked entirely on my son. The air inside the pavilion was warm and smelled of expensive catering, but when the heavy glass doors swung shut behind us, a sudden chilling silence began to ripple through the back of the crowd. The people standing near the entrance turned to look at the disturbance. They saw 2 federal agents, they saw a prominent commercial attorney, and they saw me. The whispering started immediately spreading forward like a wave of cold water. The attendees began to instinctively part, stepping to the sides, to create a wide, clear path down the center of the room. Matthew was in the middle of a grand sentence talking about the dawn of a new financial empire. He noticed the movement in the crowd. He noticed that the bankers in the front row were no longer looking up at him, but were turning their heads to look toward the back of the pavilion. Matthew stopped speaking. His hands gripped the edges of the wooden podium. He lifted his gaze and looked down the long, parted aisle directly at me. The color instantly vanished from his face. The confident, charismatic smile died on his lips, leaving his mouth slightly open in an expression of absolute, unadulterated shock. He gripped the podium so tightly, his knuckles turned completely white. He had expected to never see me again. He had convinced himself that I was hiding in some cheap motel room, terrified and penniless, stripped of my bank accounts and my dignity. He had submitted a medical document swearing to the federal government that I was physically incapable of dressing myself or recognizing my own family. But the man walking slowly down the center aisle was not a victim. The man walking toward him was the architect of his total destruction. Vanessa noticed her husband's sudden, terrifying silence. She turned around, following his gaze. When she saw me walking toward the stage, she let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with her hand. Her glittering facade crumbled instantly. The terrified reality of the empty house from that morning came rushing back to her, magnifying 1,000 times over. She realized in that exact moment that I had not run away. I had been hunting them. The entire pavilion was completely silent. The only sound was the steady rhythmic clicking of my leather dress shoes against the temporary wooden floorboards. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, deliberate pacing of a man who owns the entire room. The local politicians and the city council members watched me with wide, confused eyes. The bank executives who had approved his massive fraudulent loan began to look deeply nervous, shifting uncomfortably in their expensive suits. They recognized Warren walking beside me, and they recognized the severe demeanor of the federal marshals. The intoxicating atmosphere of wealth and success had completely evaporated, replaced by the heavy, suffocating pressure of impending doom. I reached the front of the crowd and stopped exactly 10 feet away from the base of the podium. Warren stood to my left, holding the black folder. The two federal marshals stepped slightly forward, positioning themselves between the stage and the exits. Matthew stared down at me, his chest heaving rapidly as he tried to pull oxygen into his panicked lungs. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice shaking uncontrollably. He tried to speak to regain control of his narrative, but the words simply would not form. He looked like a terrified little boy, wearing a suit that was far too large for him. "Dad." He finally managed to whisper, the sound carrying weakly through the massive speakers. "What are you doing here? You're supposed to be gone." I did not raise my voice, but I spoke clearly enough for the front rows of the audience to hear every single syllable. "I am not gone, Matthew," I said, my voice completely steady and cold. "I am exactly where I belong. I am standing on my own property. But you are currently trespassing." The crowd erupted into a low, frantic murmur of absolute confusion. Matthew desperately gripped the microphone, his eyes darting frantically toward the bank executives in the front row. He tried to force a laugh, a high-pitched, hollow sound of sheer desperation. "He is confused," Matthew told the crowd, his voice cracking. "My father is very sick. He suffers from severe dementia. He does not know what he is saying or where he is. Someone please help escort him back outside." Nobody in the crowd moved. Nobody stepped forward to help him. They simply stared at the massive contrast between the sweating, terrified young man on the stage and the perfectly composed, immaculately dressed older man standing below him. Warren stepped forward, holding up the black leather folder. He did not speak into a microphone, but his deep, authoritative voice cut through the murmurs with absolute precision. "Calvin Ford is in perfect cognitive health," Warren announced to the entire room. "We are in possession of 3 independent board-certified medical affidavits proving his absolute mental competency." The medical declaration submitted by Matthew Ford to secure the conservatorship and the $4 million loan was completely forged. The silence that followed was so profound, it felt as though the air had been entirely sucked out of the room. The bank executives sitting in the front row, the men who had wired $4 million to Vanessa's shell company, went completely rigid. They realized instantly that they were the victims of a massive, coordinated federal fraud. The grand gala had officially transformed into a crime scene. Matthew stood frozen on the podium, the bright spotlight shining down on his absolute ruin. The trap had been sprung. The audience was captive. The execution was about to begin. The heavy silence in the grand pavilion was broken only by the soft rustling of expensive fabric as the wealthy attendees shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Matthew stood frozen behind the wooden podium, his knuckles completely white as he gripped the edges of the stand. He looked down at Warren and me with an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. He had built a massive fortress out of lies, and we had just detonated the foundation. Warren did not say another word to the crowd. He simply reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out his cell phone. He kept his eyes locked entirely on Matthew as his thumb pressed the screen. A second later, a sharp electronic ringing echoed from the podium. Matthew's personal cell phone was sitting right next to the microphone. The sound was incredibly loud, amplified by the massive sound system projecting his sudden panic across the entire courtyard. Matthew stared at the vibrating device as if it were a bomb counting down to zero. He looked out at the sea of faces watching him. The city council members, the mayor, the banking executives, they were all waiting for him to do something to explain the impossible situation unfolding in front of them. Trembling, Matthew reached out and picked up the phone. He pressed it slowly to his ear without taking his eyes off Warren. Warren did not put his phone to his ear. He held it out slightly and spoke in a clear, carrying voice that easily reached the microphone Matthew was still desperately clutching. Matthew Warren said, the sound echoing ominously through the massive speakers overhead. "Your father has not lost his mind, but you have completely lost the property." Matthew dropped his phone. It hit the wooden podium with a loud clatter. His legs seemed to lose all structural integrity, and he stumbled backward, taking a clumsy step away from the microphone. He looked incredibly small, suddenly stripped of his arrogant posture and his expensive, custom-tailored facade. I walked forward and ascended the 3 short steps onto the stage. I did not look at my son as I walked past him. I stepped directly up to the wooden podium and placed my hands resting on either side of the microphone. I looked out over the massive crowd, focusing my gaze entirely on the 3 bank executives sitting in the center of the front row. They were the men who had approved the $4 million loan. They were the men who had blindly trusted my son's forged paperwork. "I am Calvin Ford." I began, my voice steady and resonant, filling the cavernous pavilion. "And I apologize for the sudden interruption to your evening, but it is entirely necessary that you understand exactly what you are celebrating tonight." I gestured toward Warren standing below the stage holding the black leather folder. I explained to the crowd that over the past 2 weeks, I had voluntarily submitted myself to 3 separate, rigorous medical examinations conducted by the most respected board-certified neurologists and forensic psychiatrists in the state. I told them that my cognitive processing speed and executive functioning had been tested for hours. I stated clearly that my intelligence quotient was tested at 135, and that I possessed absolutely 0 signs of cerebral atrophy or dementia. I watched the faces of the bank executives completely drain of color. "The medical declaration that Matthew Ford submitted to your underwriting department," I continued, my voice dropping into a cold, relentless rhythm, "was completely fabricated. He used a forged medical document to legally declare me incompetent, so he could bypass your security protocols and seize control of my commercial estate." A loud, frantic whispering erupted in the back rows of the pavilion. But the bank executives in the front remained absolutely motionless, paralyzed by the horrifying implications of my words. "But the medical forgery is only the beginning of the deception," I said, leaning slightly closer to the microphone. "You are all standing on land that belongs entirely to me. I have owned the dirt beneath these buildings for decades, and I have never once authorized the transfer of this property. The quitclaim deed that Matthew filed with the county registry, the deed he used to establish his new holding company, was completely forged." I paused, letting the weight of that reality settle over the crowd. In the eyes of the law, a forged deed is not a contestable document. I explained, delivering the final devastating financial blow. A forged deed is void from the beginning. It possesses no legal power. It transfers absolutely nothing. That means Vanessa Ford does not own this commercial warehouse park. Her holding company owns nothing but a worthless piece of paper. I locked eyes with the senior bank executive sitting directly in front of me. The man looked as though he was going to be physically sick. When your institution approved a $4 million commercial loan based on that forged deed, I told him you believed you were securing your capital against the physical equity of this land. But because the deed is entirely void, your mortgage is attached to absolutely nothing. You did not secure a commercial loan. You handed $4 million of unsecured cash directly to a man who committed severe federal wire fraud to obtain it. The senior executive abruptly stood up from his chair, his face pale and slick with sudden sweat. He turned around and frantically signaled to his colleagues. The realization had hit them with the force of a freight train. They had not just made a bad investment. They had actively funded a massive criminal enterprise, and their institution was currently missing $4 million that could never be legally recovered through a standard property foreclosure. Matthew let out a strangled, desperate sound from the back of the stage. He rushed forward, grabbing the sleeve of my charcoal suit. He pleaded with me, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. He begged me to stop talking, telling me that we could fix this, that we could go into an office and work out a private family arrangement. He promised he would pay me back every single cent if I just stopped talking into the microphone. I slowly turned my head and looked at the hand clutching my sleeve. I looked at him with an expression of absolute, profound emptiness. I did not feel anger anymore. I did not feel sorrow. I felt nothing but the cold, hard surface of justice finally locking permanently into place. "You cannot fix federal bank fraud, Matthew," I told him, my voice carrying easily over the rising panic of the crowd. "You cannot privately arrange away the theft of $4 million across state banking lines. You tried to throw me into a memory care facility to rot away in the dark so you could buy a luxury yacht and save your wife's failing vanity projects. You declared me a ghost. Now you get to deal with the haunting." I pulled my arm away from his grasp. Matthew stumbled backward, his breath coming in short, rapid gasps. He looked down at Vanessa standing at the base of the stairs. She was no longer looking at him with admiration or support. She was looking at him with absolute, terrified hatred, realizing that her entire life was completely destroyed. The proxy debt I had secretly purchased to crush her spas was now the least of her problems. She was listed as the sole managing member of the holding company that had received the stolen federal funds. She was going down right alongside him. The grand corporate gala was in a state of total, absolute chaos. The politicians were rushing toward the exits, desperately trying to distance themselves from the unfolding scandal before the press could take their photographs. The city council members were shouting into their phones, demanding their drivers bring their cars immediately. The string quartet had completely abandoned their instruments and fled the tent into the night. But the bank executives did not run. They could not run. They stormed toward the stage, their faces purple with rage, shouting at Matthew, demanding their $4 million back immediately. They surrounded the wooden steps, trapping him on the podium. I stepped away from the microphone and walked calmly down the stairs on the opposite side of the stage. I walked past the screaming executives and the terrified socialites. I walked back toward Warren and the two federal marshals who were standing patiently near the double-glass doors. They were simply waiting for the initial wave of panic to subside before they stepped forward to execute the sealed warrants. I had delivered the truth. I had stripped away the illusion entirely. Matthew had invited the entire city to witness his magnificent ascension, and instead he had broadcast his absolute destruction to the most powerful people in the state. He was completely surrounded, drowning in a sea of angry creditors and ruined politicians. The silent adjustment was complete, and the trap had been fully perfectly sprung, leaving absolutely no path for his escape. The bankers surrounded the wooden stage like a pack of starving wolves. They were shouting over each other, demanding immediate answers from my son, who was paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his reality. But before the bank executives could completely tear him apart, a loud, commanding voice cut through the chaos. It was Sterling. The regional director of the massive international shipping conglomerate stepped out from the shadows of the scattered crowd and walked directly to the front of the podium. He did not look at the angry bankers. He focused his cold, calculating gaze entirely on Matthew. Sterling reached into his tailored suit and pulled out a thick legal envelope. He spoke with the deep, booming authority of a man who controlled global supply chains, and he made sure every single person remaining in the pavilion heard his words. He announced that his shipping corporation had suffered under Matthew's arrogant and incompetent management for the last time. He stated that his board of directors had grown completely disgusted with the holding company and had executed a permanent legal solution. Sterling raised the envelope and declared that his conglomerate had just successfully purchased the entire commercial warehouse park directly from the true and legal owner. He pointed a steady finger directly at me. The crowd murmured in shock as Sterling turned his attention back to my son. He explained the brutal reality of the situation with surgical precision. Because Matthew's entire holding company was built on a forged medical declaration and a void quitclaim deed, Matthew possessed absolutely no legal standing. He had no operational authority, he had no valid lease agreements, and he certainly had no ownership rights to a single grain of dirt on the property. Sterling looked down at his expensive gold watch and announced that his private corporate security teams had already arrived at the perimeter. They were currently locking the main gates and securing the administrative buildings. Sterling looked at Matthew and delivered the final crushing blow. He told my son that because he held no legal rights to the land, he was currently standing on private corporate property without an invitation. He told Matthew that he was officially trespassing and ordered him to step off the stage immediately before corporate security physically removed him. Matthew collapsed. His knees buckled, and he dropped heavily onto the wooden floorboards of the stage. The realization physically crushed the breath out of his lungs. His massive corporate empire had completely vaporized. He had absolutely no money, he had no land, he had no power, and he had $4 million of federal fraudulent debt permanently attached to his name. The bank executives, seeing that the land was entirely out of their reach, immediately pulled out their cell phones to call their federal litigation teams. They turned their backs on the ruined boy, sobbing on the stage, completely abandoning him to his fate. While the remaining crowd focused on the pathetic sight of my son breaking down under the bright spotlights, I kept my eyes scanning the edges of the room. Rats possess an incredible instinct for knowing exactly when it is going down. I saw Vanessa slowly backing away from the stage. She was slipping quietly into the dark shadows cast by the canvas pavilion, trying to make her way toward the valet parking station. She wanted to reach her expensive car. She wanted to drive away and leave Matthew alone to take the entire federal fall for the forged documents. She truly believed her hands were clean enough to escape the blast radius. She thought she could just go back to her luxury wellness spas, distance herself from her husband's crimes, and pretend she was nothing more than an innocent victim of his ambition. I walked smoothly through the scattered chairs and intercepted her just before she reached the heavy glass exit doors. I stepped directly into her path, blocking her escape. She stopped abruptly, her eyes wide with a frantic mixture of raw fear and absolute hatred. She looked at me and hissed that she had absolutely nothing to do with the forged medical records. She claimed the entire scheme was Matthew's idea from the very beginning, and that she was planning to call a divorce attorney the very next morning. She told me to get out of her way because she needed to go manage her businesses and save her own life. I did not move a single inch. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out a heavy physical folder. It was the master debt portfolio meticulously compiled by Cross, the forensic accountant. I held it out toward her. She hesitated for a long second before her trembling hands reached out and snatched it from my grip. She flipped open the heavy cover and stared at the top sheet of paper. I watched her eyes scan the financial summaries, and I explained to her in a very calm and quiet voice exactly what she was holding. I told her that over the past week, a silent proxy firm had systematically approached every single one of her commercial landlords, her private lenders, and her luxury equipment suppliers. I told her that my proxy firm had used offshore liquid capital to purchase every single outstanding debt her failing luxury spas possessed. I explained that she no longer owed money to a dozen different angry creditors who she could easily manipulate or stall. She now owed every single penny of her massive debt directly to me. She looked up at me and her face completely devoid of color. Her hands were shaking so violently that the heavy folder slipped through her manicured fingers and hit the concrete floor with a loud slap. I did not raise my voice, but my words carried the absolute weight of a falling guillotine. I told her that her short-term commercial loan agreements contained strict morality clauses and severe financial penalties for being directly connected to federal fraud. Because she was listed as the sole managing member of the holding company that had illegally received the stolen $4 million, she was now in total catastrophic breach of all her financial covenants. I informed her that I was exercising my absolute legal right as her sole institutional creditor to call in the entirety of her debt immediately. She tried to speak, to beg or negotiate, but her voice completely failed her. She simply stared at me in absolute horror. I told her that she did not get a 30-day notice to pack her bags into cheap plastic suitcases. I told her that I was foreclosing on every single one of her luxury spas right there on the floor of the pavilion. I told her that her businesses were gone, her assets were frozen, and her future as a wealthy socialite was completely erased. She was entirely bankrupt, effective immediately. She sank slowly to her knees on the cold concrete, joining her husband in absolute, total ruin. I looked down at the two of them. They had spent the last 30 days believing they were the most brilliant architects of a new modern empire. They had laughed at my silence, assuming it was a symptom of weakness and elderly decline. They had completely forgotten that the man they were trying to bury was the exact same man who had taught them everything they knew about power. I stood over them, listening to the distant sound of approaching sirens cutting through the cold night air. The grand gala had completely collapsed into a graveyard of their own making, and I was the only one left standing, holding the master keys to the gates. The wail of the sirens grew from a distant echo into a deafening roar that vibrated through the concrete foundation of the warehouse park. Flashing red and blue lights pierced the thin white canvas of the grand pavilion, painting the terrified faces of the remaining guests in harsh alternating colors. The illusion of my son's magnificent corporate empire was officially shattered, replaced by the brutal, undeniable reality of a federal crime scene. The two senior federal marshals who had been standing quietly near the glass double doors finally stepped forward. They did not rush, and they did not draw their weapons. They moved with the slow, methodical certainty of men who knew their targets had absolutely nowhere left to run. The heavy rhythmic thud of the marshal's boots against the wooden floorboards sounded like the final ticking seconds of a clock. The crowd of panicked politicians and furious bank executives immediately parted, creating a wide, clear path for the agents. Matthew was still kneeling on the stage, his custom white tuxedo now wrinkled and stained with sweat. He watched the federal marshals approach with wide, unblinking eyes, entirely paralyzed by the magnitude of his own collapse. He had spent his entire life believing that consequences were things that only happened to other people. He believed his charm and his aggressive arrogance could manipulate any situation. But there is no manipulating the federal government when they hold the forensic evidence of your absolute guilt. The lead marshal reached the stage and stepped up effortlessly. He did not yell or act aggressively. He simply looked down at Matthew and spoke in a loud, flat voice that echoed across the silent room. He announced that Matthew Ford was officially under arrest. He listed the charges slowly, deliberately, letting every single word hang in the cold night air. Conspiracy to commit bank fraud, federal wire fraud, aggravated forgery, and the most damning charge of all, severe elder financial exploitation. The marshal reached down, grabbed Matthew by the collar of his expensive jacket, and hauled him roughly to his feet. The sharp, metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs, locking securely around his wrists, was the loudest sound in the entire pavilion. While the lead marshal secured my son, the second agent walked directly over to Vanessa. She was still crumpled on the concrete floor, staring blankly at the master debt portfolio I had dropped in front of her. When she saw the federal badge shining in the harsh police lights, she completely lost whatever shred of dignity she had left. She began to sob hysterically, crawling backward away from the agent. She screamed that she was innocent, that she was just a wife, and that she had absolutely no idea where the $4 million had come from. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at her husband on the stage, frantically trying to trade his freedom for her own. The second marshal ignored her entirely. He recited her rights, reading the charges of criminal conspiracy and accessory to federal wire fraud. He pulled her arms behind her back and snapped a second pair of steel cuffs around her wrists. The glittering designer evening gown she wore to celebrate her ascension into high society was now nothing more than the outfit she would wear to her first holding cell. The contrast between her immense greed and her pathetic surrender was absolute. A dozen uniformed local police officers poured through the main entrance, securing the perimeter and directing the shocked attendees toward the exits. The grand gala had transformed into a line of wealthy witnesses frantically trying to leave the property. Matthew was being physically guided down the wooden steps of the stage by the lead marshal. His legs were shaking so violently that the agent had to practically carry him toward the doors. As they dragged him past the spot where I was standing, Matthew dug his expensive leather shoes into the concrete, desperately trying to stop his forward momentum. He twisted his body against the grip of the federal agent and looked directly at me. His face was stained with tears, and his chest heaved with completely uncontrolled panic. The arrogant corporate titan was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, desperate boy looking for the father he had spent the last 30 days trying to destroy. "Dad," he screamed, his voice cracking and echoing off the canvas walls. "Please, Dad, you have to stop them. You have to tell them it is a misunderstanding. We can fix this. I am your son. Please, Dad, we are family." He used the word family as if it were a magical shield. He thought the biological tie between us would somehow override the fact that he had forged my signature, stolen my life work, and tried to throw me into a memory care facility to rot away in silence. He believed that parental love was a bottomless well he could poison and still drink from whenever he was thirsty. I looked at him, and I did not feel a single drop of pity. I stepped closer, stopping just inches away from his tear-stained face. The federal marshal paused for a brief second, allowing me to deliver my final judgment. I looked directly into his terrified eyes, and I spoke with a quiet, absolute finality. "A care home requires a 30-day notice for eviction." I said, my voice completely cold and perfectly steady. "Federal prison does not." "I understand perfectly." Matthew let out a hollow, devastated sob as the reality of my words completely shattered his final desperate hope. His head dropped heavily to his chest. The federal marshal shoved him forward, marching him out through the glass doors and into the harsh, flashing lights of the waiting transport vehicles. Vanessa was dragged out right behind him, her hysterical crying fading into the cold autumn night. I stood in the center of the ruined pavilion and watched the heavy doors close behind them. The quiet machinery of my revenge had executed its final maneuver flawlessly. I had not yelled, I had not thrown a single punch, and I had not broken a single law. I had simply used the truth to build a cage and let their own massive greed lock the door. The arrest was the final necessary piece of the silent adjustment. My son was gone, my property was secure, and the heavy, suffocating weight of their betrayal was finally permanently lifted from my shoulders. 6 months have passed since the night the federal marshals escorted my son out of his own manufactured kingdom. I am no longer living in the sprawling suburban house where I was handed a discount care facility brochure. I am sitting on the wide wrap-around wooden porch of a custom-built cabin nestled high in the northern mountains. The morning air is incredibly crisp, smelling of ancient pine trees and damp earth. I am holding a heavy ceramic mug of black coffee, feeling the warmth seep into my hands. The absolute silence up here is not the heavy, suffocating silence of an empty house waiting to be liquidated. It is the deep, vibrant silence of a life completely reclaimed. The federal justice system moves with a slow, grinding inevitability once the trap is finally sprung. Matthew and Vanessa did not even make it to a trial. When confronted with the sheer, undeniable volume of forensic evidence, the forged medical declarations, the void quitclaim deed, and the paper trail of the stolen $4 million, their expensive defense attorneys immediately advised them to take a plea deal. They turned on each other almost instantly. They sat in separate interrogation rooms and desperately tried to blame one another for the grand conspiracy. It did not matter. The federal judge sentenced them both to substantial terms in federal prison. The luxury yacht they bought with my legacy was seized and auctioned off by the government. The commercial warehouse park is now fully owned and operated by Sterling's shipping conglomerate. The money from that massive sale cleared my name completely and left me with a liquid fortune I never intended to touch again. But sitting alone with millions of dollars in a mountain cabin is just another form of a waiting room. I realized that my survival was a massive exception to a very tragic rule. Most fathers and mothers who are handed those glossy care home brochures by greedy children do not have hidden offshore accounts. They do not have the resources to hire ruthless forensic accountants like Cross or brilliant corporate attorneys like Warren. They simply pack their cheap plastic suitcases and disappear into the forgotten corners of the medical system, stripped of their dignity and their life savings. I could not just walk away knowing that the exact same fraud that nearly buried me was currently suffocating thousands of other elderly people. I took the massive profits from the sale of the warehouse park and the liquidated assets of Vanessa's foreclosed spas, and I built something entirely new. Warren and I founded a specialized nonprofit legal clinic located right in the heart of the financial district. We hired the most aggressive young financial litigators we could find, and we retained Cross on a permanent consultancy retainer. Our sole mission is to hunt down predatory family members and corrupt medical professionals who attempt to financially exploit the elderly. We do not charge our clients a single penny. We take the complex cases, the forged powers of attorney, the coerced property transfers, and the fraudulent conservatorships, and we absolutely dismantle the perpetrators in federal court. Just last week, our team successfully reversed a hostile eviction where a nephew tried to steal his aunt's farm using the exact same playbook Matthew tried to use on me. We brought the full weight of the federal authorities down on him and returned the deed to the rightful owner. We bring the legal guillotine to the people who think they can prey on the weak in the dark. I take another slow sip of my coffee, watching the morning sun finally break over the jagged peaks of the mountain range. The golden light spills across the wooden porch, warming the cold morning air. I used to believe that blood was the absolute foundation of legacy. I believed that you owed your children everything simply because you brought them into the world. I thought that sacrifice was a one-way street, and that enduring disrespect was just the price of being a parent. I was completely wrong. True family is not defined by ungrateful bloodlines or shared last names. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. True family is defined by absolute mutual respect, genuine loyalty, and the courage to protect one another from harm. If someone looks at you and sees only a resource to be extracted, they are not your family. They are a parasite, and they must be removed from your life with absolute prejudice. I do not miss my son. I do not mourn the loss of the relationship, because the relationship was nothing but a convenient illusion he maintained until he decided I was no longer useful. Letting go of that illusion did not destroy me. It set me completely free. I do not receive phone calls demanding money, and I do not have to endure the fake smiles of a daughter-in-law who is secretly planning my demise. I am surrounded only by people who value my mind, my experience, and my unyielding commitment to the truth. Life is no longer a slow, inevitable march toward decline. It is defined by absolute peace earned through the ruthless application of the truth. I breathe in the cold mountain air, feeling stronger and sharper than I have in decades. I look out over the vast, untouched wilderness stretching out before my cabin, and I feel a profound sense of limitless potential. I am Calvin Ford. I am 67 years old, and my life has just truly begun. The greatest lesson we can take from this story is that true strength does not always roar. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal is absolute silence and careful calculation. Greed blinds people to the foundation they stand on, making them believe that age equates to weakness and that family ties can excuse unforgivable disrespect. But dignity is not something you surrender simply because you grow older. True family is built on mutual respect and genuine loyalty, not just shared blood. When someone shows you they view you only as an expired resource, believe them and have the absolute courage to rewrite your own ending. If this story inspired you to stand up for your own dignity, please hit the subscribe button and share your thoughts in the comments below.